The air inside the Sovereign was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, a tangible substance, thick with the scent of old leather, Cuban cigar smoke lingering like a ghost in the velvet curtains, and the earthy, decadent aroma of truffle oil that clung to everything. It smelled of power, of transactions that shaped the city's skyline, whispered in conversations too quiet for the uninitiated to decipher. Light did not simply illuminate the space, it dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, shattering into a million shimmering pieces on the polished mahogany bar, and catching the glint of gold on $100,000 watches. The sound was a symphony of wealth, the muted clink of heavy silver cutlery on fine china, the deep, resonant pour of a 1982 Bordeaux into a delicate glass, and the almost imperceptible hum of a state-of-the-art ventilation system that whisked away any hint of the outside world, of the common, dirty city. Through this gilded sanctuary moved Leo Rossi, a phantom in a gray janitor's uniform. He was a master of invisibility, his movements fluid and silent, his presence as unremarkable as the ornate wallpaper he meticulously wiped clean. His rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the Persian rugs, and his gaze was always respectfully lowered, a practiced habit that made him part of the furniture, a necessary but unseen component of this elaborate machine for the elite. As Leo polished a brass door handle, its cool, solid weight a familiar anchor in his hands, his mind drifted far from the opulent prison of the present. The acrid scent of the industrial-grade polish was a stark, chemical interruption to the club's rich bouquet, and it always transported him back. He saw the dusty archives of the university library, the brittle, yellowed pages of centuries-old birth records under his fingertips. He remembered the thrill of discovery, the intellectual fire that burned in him as he pieced together family lineages, tracing bloodlines through wars and migrations, a brilliant history prodigy with a future as bright as the chandeliers above him. That life felt like a story he'd read about someone else, a dream from which he'd been violently shaken awake. The memory was always followed by the sharp, sterile smell of a hospital, the scent that had become the true backdrop of his existence for the last decade. The scholarship, the research, the promise, it all evaporated the day his mother's world collapsed. He traded his academic pursuits for a mop and bucket, his study of history for the repetitive, mindless present, a silent sacrifice laid at the altar of familiar duty. The contrast was a quiet agony he swallowed down each night, a bitter pill that never fully dissolved. His motivation was not a grand ambition, but a quiet, desperate prayer for peace. It lived in the image of his mother, propped against a mountain of pillows in a sterile, rented medical bed that now dominated her small living room. Her decline had been a slow, devastating erosion of the vibrant woman he once knew. It began after the official letter arrived, the one declaring her firstborn son, who had vanished without a trace decades ago, legally dead. The news didn't bring closure, it carved a hole in her soul that could never be filled. Grief became a chronic illness, a weight that crushed her spirit and then her body, leaving her trapped in a fog of sorrow and confusion. Leo's life became a singular mission, to pay for the nurses, the medication, the quiet room that kept her comfortable. Every dollar he earned wiping down the excesses of the rich was a small shield against the world's harshness for her. He endured the dismissive glances and the feeling of being a ghost so that she could have some semblance of dignity in her final years. He could still remember her laughter, a sound like wind chimes, from a time when she believed both her sons were alive and well. That memory was the fuel that kept him going, a sacred flame he protected in the cold, lonely hours of his shift. The hushed symphony of the Sovereign was shattered by a subtle but seismic shift in the atmosphere. It was the arrival of Marco the Vulture. He didn't just enter a room, he conquered it. The air grew colder, conversations faltered, and the deferential staff seemed to shrink into the walls. Marco moved with the predatory grace of a shark, his presence a vortex of intimidation that pulled all energy toward him. He was dressed in a bespoke Italian suit of such a dark, rich navy it was nearly black, a garment that likely cost more than the car Leo would never be able to afford. His face was a mask of cold authority, but a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand and a sallow, grayish tint beneath his meticulously maintained tan betrayed a secret vulnerability. It was a weakness he masked with an aura of absolute, untouchable power. His consigliere and two immense bodyguards flanked him, not as companions, but as extensions of his own formidable will, their silent presence a testament to the brutal empire he commanded under the guise of his private equity firm, Volante Capital. The sound of his handmade leather shoes clicking against the marble floor was a metronome of dread, each step an assertion of his dominance over this world and everyone in it. This is a story you won't want to miss, a collision of two worlds bound by a secret that money cannot buy and power cannot command.
Before we dive into the heart of this confrontation, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience connect over these powerful narratives. And if you believe in stories where the underdog rises and justice finds its way, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have turned on notifications. The stage is set in this temple of wealth for an event that will unravel decades of lies and expose a truth hidden in the most unexpected of places. The journey into the soul of this family, torn apart by ambition and reunited by fate, begins now, and you are invited to bear witness to every shocking turn and every moment of hard-won triumph. Your engagement helps us bring more tales like this to light, so take a moment to join our community before the world of Leo Rossi and Marco Volante changes forever. The confrontation is imminent, a storm gathering silently within the gilded walls of the Sovereign, and its fallout will be unforgettable. Inside the private dining room, a space reserved for the city's true kings, the opulence was suffocating. The walls were paneled with dark, rare wood, and a single, priceless painting of a stormy seascape hung above the fireplace, mirroring the tempest brewing within Marco Volante. He sat at the head of a long, empty table, not eating but presiding over a different kind of feast, the utter failure of his subordinates. His two top physicians, men renowned in their fields, stood before him like schoolboys awaiting a caning. The air was thick with the scent of their fear and Marco's expensive citrus-laced cologne. He looked at them with a gaze devoid of all warmth, a predator's assessment of useless prey. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. He berated them for their inability to find a donor, for their pathetic excuses and medical jargon that meant nothing to a man who measured the world in profit and loss. His own body was betraying him, a biological mutiny that his immense wealth could not quell. This infuriated him more than any business rival ever could. It was an insult from the universe itself, and these highly paid doctors were the unfortunate messengers he was intent on shooting. Leo was in the corner of the room, tasked with polishing the intricate woodwork of a serving cart. He moved with a practiced slowness, his focus entirely on the repetitive circular motion of his cloth, a meditation that allowed him to disappear. He had learned long ago how to make himself deaf to the conversations of the powerful, to treat their words as nothing more than ambient noise. It was a survival mechanism, but he could feel the tension in the room coiling like a snake. He felt Marco Volante's gaze land on him, a physical weight that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was a look he knew well, the casual, dismissive glance of a superior being observing a lower life form. In that moment, Leo was no longer a man. He was an object, a prop in the drama of Marco's frustration. He kept his back to the table, his shoulders slightly hunched, making himself smaller, less significant. He could hear the soft rustle of Marco's suit as he shifted in his chair, the sound of a predator adjusting its position before the strike. He braced himself, a familiar coldness settling in his stomach, the practiced indifference he wore as armor every single day. Marco scoffed, a dry, rattling sound of pure contempt that seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the room. He gestured languidly towards Leo, his hand moving through the air with an elegant cruelty. The gesture was not for the doctors, but for himself, a way to reassert his place at the top of the food chain even as his own blood rebelled against him. "You search the globe for a thoroughbred," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, his eyes still fixed on the back of Leo's gray uniform. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. But the city is full of mules. The doctors shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking from Marco to Leo and back again, their faces pale. The consigliere remained motionless, his expression as hard and unreadable as granite. For them, it was just another of the boss's casual cruelties. For Leo, the words were a physical blow. He felt a familiar hot surge of shame, but something else followed close behind it. A cold, quiet anger that was as deep and still as a frozen lake. He did not turn, he did not react. He simply continued his circular polishing, his movements becoming more precise, more deliberate, as if the simple repetitive task could keep the rage from boiling over. The final venomous strike came without hesitation. Marco leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking tone, ensuring everyone in the room was included in his little performance of dominance. "Look at him," he commanded, the words sharp and pointed, aimed directly at Leo's back. The bottom of the gene pool. A terrible silence followed, broken only by the faint, rhythmic sound of Leo's cloth against the wood. Marco let the insult land, savoring its impact. Then he delivered the killing blow, a final piece of casual brutality meant to affirm his own superiority in the face of his terrifying mortality. His blood is probably as thin as his wallet. In that instant, as the insult echoed in the silent room, the world inside Leo Rossi shifted.
The image of his mother's tired, grief-stricken face flashed in his mind, her frail hand clutching his. This man, this arrogant titan of industry, knew nothing of real value, of the richness of sacrifice, of the strength required to endure. The humiliation did not break him. It forged something new within him. The quiet janitor, the invisible man, felt a lifetime of suppressed dignity crystallize into a single point of diamond-hard resolve. He stopped polishing. His hand, holding the rag, tightened into a fist, and in the reflection on the gleaming polished wood, his eyes held a fire that had been dormant for far too long. The silence that followed Marco's insult was a living thing. A heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the faint clinking of distant silverware and the soft hum of the air conditioning. For Leo, time itself seemed to warp, stretching that single, brutal moment into an eternity. He stood frozen, his knuckles white where they gripped the polishing cloth, his gaze fixed on his own distorted reflection in the polished mahogany. The face staring back at him was that of a stranger, a hollowed-out man whose features were blurred by the varnish. He felt the blood drain from his own face, a cold tide receding, leaving behind a numb, tingling emptiness. The phrase, "the bottom of the gene pool," echoed in the cavernous space of his mind, not as a simple insult, but as a verdict, a final judgment on a life defined by sacrifice and quiet endurance. He could feel the eyes of the doctors on his back, their pity a far more searing brand than Marco's contempt. He imagined their thoughts, their clinical assessments of his posture, his worn uniform, his very existence. He was a specimen to them, an example used to illustrate a point. In that gilded room, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, Leo Rossi had never felt more impoverished, not in his wallet, but in his very soul. The fury was there, a deep, subterranean fire, but it was buried beneath layers of exhaustion and a grief so old it felt like a part of his own DNA. He fought the primal urge to turn, to speak, to shatter the carefully constructed invisibility he had worn for a decade. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of expensive wood polish and bitter humiliation, and forced his hand to move again, the circular motion a desperate prayer for normalcy in a world that had just been ripped from its axis. The days that followed were a blur of muted dread and heightened anxiety that permeated the very atmosphere of the sovereign. Marco Volante's health declined with a terrifying swiftness, a fact that was whispered in hushed tones among the staff and reflected in the grim, tight-lipped expressions of the men who guarded his private suites. The search for a donor had become a frantic global manhunt, a testament to the long reach of Marco's power. His organization, Volante Capital, which was in truth a finely tuned criminal enterprise, mobilized its vast resources with chilling efficiency. Phone calls were made to private clinics in Zurich, to research hospitals in Tokyo, and to black market brokers in shadowy corners of Eastern Europe. Millions of dollars were offered, no questions asked, for a single unit of the impossibly rare Bombay blood type. The city's medical infrastructure was bent to Marco's will. Databases were illegally accessed, and patient records were scanned by sophisticated algorithms, all in a desperate search for a genetic needle in a haystack of 7 million people. Yet every lead turned into a dead end. The world, for all its billions of inhabitants, seemed to have conspired to deny this one man the thing he needed most. For Leo, this unseen chaos manifested as a palpable tension in the club. He saw the strain on the faces of Marco's lieutenants, the dark circles under their eyes, and the barely concealed panic that flickered in their gazes. He overheard snippets of conversations, words like incompatible, negative, and running out of time, and felt a strange, detached sense of cosmic justice. The universe was finally presenting a bill that even Marco Volante, with all his stolen wealth, could not pay. As a final desperate measure, Marco's chief physician, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, whose reputation was now inextricably tied to Marco's survival, initiated a citywide emergency screening. It was a public relations masterpiece, framed as a corporate wellness initiative sponsored by Volante Capital, a hollow gesture of philanthropy that masked its true, singular purpose. Mobile donation clinics appeared in public squares, and mandatory health screenings were implemented in every building and business under Marco's direct or indirect control. This, of course, included the sovereign. For the staff, it was just another corporate mandate, an inconvenient interruption to their long shifts. They lined up in the service corridors, their sleeves rolled up, their expressions a mixture of boredom and resentment. Leo stood in that line, the sterile smell of alcohol swabs a sharp contrast to the familiar scent of bleach and floor wax that clung to his uniform. He felt a profound sense of futility. He was merely a number, a data point to be collected and discarded, another body to be processed by the vast, impersonal machine of his employer. When the needle slid into his vein, he barely flinched, his mind elsewhere, calculating the cost of his mother's latest prescription and worrying about the rattling sound the old boiler in their apartment had started making. He was so consumed by the small, pressing anxieties of his own life that he failed to notice the phlebotomist's brief, curious frown as she labeled his vial, a tiny flicker of confusion at the unusual way his blood reacted to the preliminary typing test. The discovery happened in the sterile, fluorescent-lit silence of a laboratory deep in the city's medical district, miles away from the opulent theater of the Sovereign. It was 3 in the morning, a time when the city held its breath, and a junior lab technician was running the final batch of samples from the Volante screening. Her eyes, blurry from caffeine and exhaustion, scanned the results on her monitor, a monotonous stream of A positives, O negatives, and B pluses. It was routine work, soul-crushingly repetitive, until one result made her stop. She blinked, leaning closer to the screen, certain it was a machine error. The sample, designated only by a barcode, showed a complete absence of the A, B, and H antigens. It was a pattern she had only ever seen in textbooks, a genetic ghost. The Bombay phenotype. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet lab. She ran the test again, her hands trembling slightly. The result was the same. Then a third time with a fresh reagent. Identical. This wasn't an error. It was a 1 in a million miracle. She immediately called her supervisor, who in turn called the head of the hematology department. And within an hour, the information had rocketed up the chain of command, a signal flare of hope in the desperate night. The barcode was traced back to its source, cross-referenced with employee files, and a name was finally attached to the miracle sample. Leo Rossi, a janitor. The news landed on Dr. Finch's desk just before dawn, a single sheet of paper that held the power of life and death, a document that would irrevocably alter the balance of power in their gilded world. Dr. Finch did not delegate this task. The stakes were too high, the situation too volatile. He knew Marco's temperament, his explosive pride, and his utter contempt for the very man who was now his only hope. He approached the task with the grim determination of a bomb disposal expert. Flanked by 2 of Marco's bodyguards, men whose tailored suits did little to conceal the sheer mass of muscle beneath, he moved through the hushed, early morning corridors of the Sovereign. They did not find Leo in the grand dining rooms or polished lobbies. They found him in a cramped, windowless utility closet in the building's subbasement, a forgotten corner of the empire that smelled of damp concrete and industrial-strength ammonia. Leo was on his knees, meticulously organizing bottles of cleaning solution on a low shelf, his world reduced to this small, thankless task. The sudden appearance of the three men filled the narrow doorway, plunging the small space into shadow. Leo looked up, his eyes adjusting to the sudden darkness, his heart lurching with a primal fear. Men like this did not seek out men like him for good news. Dr. Finch, his face pale and etched with sleeplessness, knelt down, an act of deference that was so out of place it felt surreal. His voice was low, stripped of all medical jargon, and heavy with the weight of his message. He explained the situation in simple, direct terms. Marco Volante was dying, his blood was a rare type, and Leo, through a staggering coincidence of genetics, was the only compatible donor they had found on the entire continent. He was, in that moment, the most valuable man in the city. Leo listened, but the words did not immediately connect. They seemed to float in the stale air of the closet, abstract and disconnected from reality. It felt like a cruel, elaborate joke. He, the mule, the bottom of the gene pool, was the key to the survival of the thoroughbred. The irony was so immense, so profound, it was almost suffocating. He looked past the doctor to the two silent giants in the doorway, their faces impassive, their presence a silent threat. He saw the desperation in Dr. Finch's eyes, the pleading of a man caught between a dying boss and an impossible situation. A wave of vertigo washed over Leo as the implications of the doctor's words crashed down upon him. The power dynamic of his entire world had just been inverted. For 10 years, he had been a ghost, a non-entity, his existence acknowledged only when a spill needed to be cleaned or a floor needed to be mopped. Now, the man who held the city in his fist, the man who had casually dismissed his very humanity, needed him. Not just needed him, but was entirely, pathetically dependent on him for his next breath. A strange calm settled over Leo, a cold, clear stillness that pushed aside the initial shock. He felt the weight of his mother's suffering, the years of his own sacrificed dreams, and the sting of Marco's recent humiliation, all coalescing into a single, unyielding point of resolve. He was no longer just a janitor in a closet. He was the gatekeeper, and the king was begging for entry. The news was delivered to Marco Volante in his penthouse suite, a space that resembled a modern fortress more than a home.
He was propped up in bed, the silken sheets doing little to soften the new, sharp angles of his face. The illness had begun to strip away his physical facade, revealing the brittle fear beneath. When Dr. Finch delivered the news, he did so with the careful, measured tone of a diplomat negotiating a ceasefire. He laid out the facts, the impossible odds, the single match, the donor's identity. Marco listened in silence, his expression unreadable. But as the name Leo Rossi left the doctor's lips, something in him shattered. It was not a loud, explosive break, but a silent, catastrophic implosion of his entire worldview. His universe, which had always been governed by a rigid hierarchy of strength and weakness, of superior and inferior bloodlines, had been turned into a mockery. His survival, his legacy, his very life now depended on the thin blood of the man he had so casually and publicly degraded. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the sprawling city skyline visible through his panoramic windows. The city he owned, the city that feared him, now seemed to be laughing at him. A deep, guttural sound escaped his throat, a noise somewhere between a laugh and a sob. And then came the rage. It was a volcanic eruption of pure, undiluted fury, directed not at the doctor, but at the cosmos itself, at the sheer, insulting injustice of it all. He hurled a crystal glass against the wall, its shattering a poor echo of the chaos raging inside him. He refused to go to the hospital. He refused to be seen in a state of weakness. The transaction, as he now saw it, would take place on his own turf, in the heart of his power. He summoned Leo to his private study at the Sovereign, the same room where deals were made and lives were quietly dismantled. The walk for Leo from the service elevator to the executive wing was a journey across a social chasm. The staff, who had once looked through him as if he were made of glass, now watched him with a mixture of awe, fear, and morbid curiosity. Whispers followed him down the plush carpeted hallways. the news having spread through the club's gossip network like wildfire. He was no longer Leo the janitor. He was Leo the lifeline, a figure of mythic importance. He felt their stares like a physical touch, and it steeled his resolve. He knocked on the massive oak door of Marco's study, the sound echoing in the silent hall. He entered a room that was the very embodiment of power. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that had never been read. A desk the size of a small car, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. Marco was there, not behind the desk, but standing by the window, his back to the room. He was dressed in a silk robe, a pathetic attempt to project an aura of casual dominance that his frail, trembling frame utterly betrayed. He looked smaller, diminished, a king without his armor. Marco did not turn around for a full minute, forcing Leo to stand in the center of the vast room, a deliberate power play meant to intimidate. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, but he laced it with the old familiar arrogance, a tool he wielded like a weapon. He didn't ask, he informed. He spoke of a transfer of funds, of a numbered Swiss bank account that would be created in Leo's name. He named a figure, a sum so large it was almost comical, 7 figures that could transform Leo's life, that could provide his mother with the best care in the world for the rest of her days. He spoke of it not as a gift or a reward, but as a fair market price for a rare commodity. He was purchasing a biological product, and he expected prompt delivery. Throughout his monologue, he never once used Leo's name, referring to him only as the donor. It was a final, desperate attempt to maintain the fiction of his own superiority, to reduce this life-or-death negotiation to a simple, impersonal business transaction. He was buying blood, just as he would buy a company or a piece of art, and he expected the seller to be grateful for the opportunity. The entire performance was for his own benefit, a way to convince himself that he was still in control. Leo stood motionless, listening to the offer. The money was a siren's call, a promise of an end to all his struggles. He saw a flash of a different life, a small, comfortable house for his mother, a garden, nurses who were kind and well paid, an existence free from the constant grinding weight of financial worry. The temptation was immense, a physical pull. But then he looked at the back of Marco Volante's head, at the proud, defiant set of his shoulders, and he saw not a benefactor, but the architect of his family's ruin. The insult from the dining room was no longer the primary wound. It was merely a symptom of a much deeper disease, a rot of the soul that no amount of money could cure. This man's a rarity, his belief that everything and everyone had a price, was the very thing that had allowed him to abandon his own family decades ago, to sever his roots and reinvent himself as a monster, leaving a wake of devastation behind him. In that moment of profound clarity, Leo understood that accepting the money would be the ultimate act of submission. It would validate Marco's entire worldview. It would mean that his blood, his very life force, was just another asset to be bought and sold.
He thought of his mother, not of her comfort, but of her honor, of the quiet dignity she had maintained through years of unimaginable grief. A quiet strength, a strength Marco could never comprehend, filled him. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, calm, and utterly clear. It was a single word that echoed in the cavernous study, a word that Marco Volante had likely not heard in decades. No. The word struck Marco with the force of a physical blow. He flinched, his shoulders tightening as if to absorb the impact. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The quiet tick of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room seemed to grow impossibly loud, marking the seconds of a new and terrifying reality for the man who had always controlled time itself. He turned around slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. His eyes, sunken and clouded with illness, bored into Leo, searching for a sign of weakness, a hint of negotiation. He saw none. He saw only a calm, unyielding resolve that was more infuriating than any outright defiance. The refusal was not a negotiating tactic, it was a judgment. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful businessman crumbled, and the vicious, cornered animal beneath was revealed. The pretense of a transaction vanished, replaced by the raw, brutal language of coercion, the only language Marco truly understood. His voice dropped, losing its rasp and gaining a chilling, venomous edge. He began to speak, not of money, but of ruin. He laid out, with the meticulous detail of a master strategist, exactly how he would dismantle Leo's small, fragile life, piece by painstaking piece. He started with Leo's job. He described how he would not just have him fired from the Sovereign, but blacklisted from every service industry position in the city. He would become untouchable, a pariah. His name would be flagged in every employment database, ensuring that he would never again earn an honest wage to clean a floor or wash a dish. He would be cast out, left to starve on the very streets he once swept. Then he moved on to Leo's home. He spoke of the building Leo and his mother lived in, a property owned by a subsidiary of a company that was, in turn, owned by Volante Capital. He explained how a simple phone call would result in an immediate eviction notice, citing fabricated violations of the lease agreement. He painted a vivid, cruel picture of Leo and his sick mother being thrown out onto the sidewalk, their meager possessions piled up on the curb for all the world to see. He described their descent into the city's shelter system, a bureaucratic nightmare of filth, violence, and utter despair. He wanted Leo to see it, to feel the cold pavement, to smell the desperation. Finally, and with the most exquisite cruelty, he targeted Leo's mother. He knew, with a predator's instinct, that this was the heart of his opponent's strength, and he aimed his final, most poisonous dart directly at it. He spoke of her nursing care, the agency that provided the skilled professionals who managed her medication and kept her comfortable. He revealed that he had already purchased a controlling interest in the agency that very morning. He explained with a chillingly calm voice how he would cut off her care immediately. The nurses would stop coming, the supply of expensive medications would dry up. He would ensure she was transferred to the worst state-funded facility in the region, a place notorious for neglect and abuse, a place where the elderly were left to wither away in lonely, forgotten silence. He let the threat hang in the air, a vision of unimaginable suffering designed to break Leo's spirit completely. He was not just threatening Leo's life, he was threatening to desecrate the one sacred thing Leo had left in the world. He was turning Leo's greatest love into his greatest vulnerability, and he savored the power it gave him. He saw himself not as a villain, but a teacher, instructing the janitor in the fundamental lesson of his world. Absolute power tolerates no dissent. Leo listened to the litany of threats, each one a carefully crafted instrument of psychological torture. He felt the cold knot of fear in his stomach, the primal terror of a man watching his world being held hostage. The images Marco painted were vivid and horrifying. His mother, alone and afraid in a sterile, uncaring ward. Their belongings scattered on a dirty street. The gnawing emptiness of hunger and hopelessness. Every word was designed to crush him, to force him to his knees, to make him beg. But as Marco spoke, something unexpected happened within Leo. The fear did not metastasize into panic. Instead, it began to burn away, calcifying into something else entirely. It became a cold, diamond-hard certainty. He looked at the sick, pathetic man in the silk robe, a man so spiritually impoverished that his only tool was the suffering of others, and he felt not fear, but a profound, clarifying pity. This man was not a god, he was a disease, a cancer that had spread from his own body to the world around him. And Leo, the historian, the researcher, the man who understood that history is a story of powerful men underestimating the quiet forces that eventually bring them down, knew that a disease must be fought. The last vestiges of the invisible janitor, the man who kept his head down and his opinions to himself, were incinerated in the crucible of Marco's threats.
In his place stood Leo Rossi, the scholar, the strategist, the son whose love for his mother had just been forged into an unbreakable weapon.
He realized that this was no longer about a blood donation. This was a war that had been declared on his family long before he was even born. A war started when a young man, full of selfish ambition, decided his family was a weight holding him down. Marco's threats were not a display of strength. They were a confession of his greatest weakness. He had revealed the one thing he could not control, the one person he desperately needed, and in doing so, had handed Leo the key to his own destruction. A quiet resolution settled over Leo, as calm and as deep as the ocean. He would not save this man. Not yet. First, he would unearth the truth. He would find out who Marco Volante truly was, and he would use that truth to reclaim the life and the dignity that had been stolen from his family. He turned without another word and walked out of the study, leaving Marco Volante alone in his opulent prison, surrounded by the trappings of a power that had just been rendered meaningless. The click of the door shutting behind him was a sound of finality, the closing of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. As Leo walked through the gilded corridors of the Sovereign and out into the cold, indifferent night of the city, he was no longer a victim. He was a hunter. His mind, long dormant, sparked back to life, the instincts of the researcher taking over. He needed information. He needed leverage. He needed an ally who knew how to navigate the labyrinthine world of buried secrets and hidden histories. A name from his past surfaced in his memory, a name he hadn't thought of in years. Professor Abernathy, his old mentor at the university, a brilliant and notoriously tenacious historian who specialized in uncovering the secrets of the city's most powerful families. A man who loved nothing more than a good fight against an arrogant titan. The first step of his counterattack was clear. The board was set, and for the first time in his life, Leo Rossi was ready to make his move. Professor Alistair Abernathy's office was a fortress of knowledge, a sanctuary built from paper and time. Nestled deep within the Gothic heart of the university Leo had been forced to abandon. The air inside was a physical presence, thick with the comforting, dusty scent of aging books, a smell that was the polar opposite of the sterile, chemical cleanliness of the Sovereign. It smelled of history itself, of decaying leather bindings, brittle pages, and the faint, sweet aroma of the professor's cherry pipe tobacco, a fragrance that clung to the heavy velvet curtains and the worn oriental rug. Light struggled to penetrate the grime on the tall arched window, and what little made it through was immediately absorbed by the towering shelves of books that lined every wall, floor to ceiling, creating a labyrinth of human thought. For Leo, stepping into this room was like coming home to a life he had only ever been allowed to dream of. It was a painful reminder of the path not taken, of the intellectual fire that had been banked to a mere ember by the cold realities of his existence. He felt the familiar weight of his janitor's uniform as an alien skin in this place of intellect, a costume he desperately wished he could shed forever. Abernathy was exactly as Leo remembered him, a magnificent ruin of a man with a wild mane of silver hair, a tweed jacket permanently dusted with ash, and eyes that still held the sharp, penetrating glint of a hawk. He sat behind a desk that was less a piece of furniture and more a geological formation, a landscape of stacked books, scattered papers, and precariously balanced teacups. He peered at Leo over a pair of half-moon spectacles, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to a slow, dawning recognition. A smile cracked the weathered terrain of his face, a genuine warmth that momentarily thawed the decade of ice that had formed around Leo's heart. The professor did not comment on Leo's uniform, or the exhaustion etched into his features. He simply gestured to a rickety wooden chair, an invitation that transcended the vast gulf of time and circumstance that separated them. In Abernathy's eyes, Leo was not a janitor. He was still the brilliant, hungry young mind he had once mentored, the most promising student he had seen in 40 years of teaching. That simple, unspoken acceptance was a balm to a wound Leo hadn't even realized was still open and raw. Leo sat, the old chair groaning in protest, and for a long moment, he struggled to find the words. The story felt too fantastic, too grotesque to be spoken aloud in this quiet, rational sanctuary of learning. He began hesitantly, his voice low and rough from disuse, laying out the impossible sequence of events. He spoke of the Sovereign, a world Abernathy would only know from the society pages of newspapers. He described Marco Volante, not as a name in the financial section, but as a living, breathing monster of casual cruelty. He recounted the humiliation in the private dining room, the words that had branded him as less than human. Then he explained the impossible twist of fate, the revelation of the Bombay blood, and the subsequent threats that held his mother's life in the balance. As he spoke, he watched his old mentor's face. The initial warmth was replaced by a familiar, intense focus.
Abernathy leaned forward, his elbows clearing a small space on the cluttered desk, his pipe forgotten in a heavy glass ashtray. The historian in him was awakening, the hunter of secrets, his mind already sifting through the narrative, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for the hidden levers of power. When Leo finished, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant chime of the university clock tower. Abernathy leaned back in his chair, the springs screeching in protest, and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. He looked at Leo, his gaze sharp and analytical, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips. It was the smile of a chess master who had just been presented with the most fascinating and high-stakes game of his life. He saw it all, not just as a human drama, but as a classic historical paradigm, the hubris of the tyrant, the hidden strength of the oppressed, and the immutable power of a truth that refuses to stay buried. He recognized Marco Volante as a modern-day Medici or Borgia, a man who believed his power made him immune to the fundamental laws of decency and, now, biology. And in Leo, he saw the unlikeliest of assassins, a man armed not with a dagger, but with a secret locked in his own veins, a secret that could topple an empire. The professor's mind, a vast archive of fallen tyrants and forgotten histories, began to churn, formulating a strategy. The plan Abernathy proposed was one of elegant simplicity and profound risk. It was a strategy born from a deep understanding of history and human nature, particularly the nature of arrogant men. They would not refuse the donation. They would not run. Instead, they would use the very process Marco had initiated as their primary weapon. The pre-transfusion protocol for a patient as wealthy and paranoid as Volante would be exhaustive. It would be a deep, invasive dive into Leo's entire life, his genetics, his family history, his very biological makeup. They would demand records, documents, and histories to ensure the donor was clean. This, Abernathy explained, was their Trojan horse. They would give Marco's team exactly what they wanted, but in doing so, they would force them to uncover a truth they were not prepared for. They would make Marco's own meticulous, self-serving process the instrument of his unmasking. The beauty of it, Abernathy pointed out with a glint in his eye, was that they wouldn't have to find the truth. They would force Marco's own system to deliver it to them on a silver platter. The following days were a disorienting plunge into a world of sterile white rooms and cold, impersonal technology. Leo was escorted by Marco's silent bodyguards to a private wing of a hospital that felt more like a luxury hotel, a place where sickness was treated as an inconvenient and unsightly condition to be hidden away. He was subjected to a battery of tests that seemed designed to quantify every aspect of his existence. His blood was drawn and analyzed by a dozen different machines. His body was scanned and mapped by humming, claustrophobic tubes, and his history was dissected by a team of impassive doctors. He felt like a lab rat, a biological commodity whose value was being meticulously assessed before purchase. During the interviews, he answered questions about his family's medical history with a carefully constructed narrative, speaking of his parents and his one tragically deceased older brother. Each lie felt like a small betrayal of his mother's grief, a necessary sin on the path to a greater justice. He held his composure, channeling the quiet invisibility he had perfected over a decade, allowing them to see only what they expected to see, a simple, uncomplicated man from the bottom of the gene pool. It was during the second round of genetic sequencing that the first crack in Marco's carefully constructed reality appeared. The doctor overseeing the process was a man named Elias Vance, an older, semi-retired hematologist who had been pulled back into service for this one high-profile case. Dr. Vance was a man of science,
a purist who held a deep disdain for the theatrics and arrogance that surrounded men like Marco Volante. He trusted data, not reputations. As he reviewed the preliminary results of Leo's chromosomal analysis, he paused. His brow furrowed, and he leaned closer to the high-resolution monitor, his eyes tracing a specific sequence of genetic markers on the long arm of chromosome 9. It was a rare haplotype, a specific signature he had seen only once before in his long career, in a research paper on isolated populations in southern Italy. On its own, it was a curiosity, but when he cross-referenced it with the partial genetic profile they had on file for Marco, a cold knot of impossibility began to form in his stomach. The same rare haplotype was present. It was not just similar, it was a near-perfect familial match. Dr. Vance initially dismissed it as a statistical anomaly, a 1 in a billion coincidence. The odds were astronomical, but not technically impossible. However, the scientist in him, the part that craved order and logical explanation, could not let it go. It was a loose thread in an otherwise perfect tapestry, and he felt an obsessive need to pull on it. He ordered a more detailed, deep sequence analysis, a costly and time-consuming process that he justified to Marco's team as a necessary precaution against rare genetic incompatibilities.
He knew it was a lie, a smokescreen for his own burgeoning, wild suspicion. While the machines hum and the lab technicians worked, Dr. Vance began his own, more traditional investigation. He started with the official records. He pulled up Leo Rossi's birth certificate, which was straightforward and clean. Then he tried to pull up Marco Volante's. He hit a digital brick wall. The file was sealed, classified at a level that even the hospital's top administrative access couldn't bypass. It was an act of erasure so complete, so total, that it was more incriminating than any criminal record. Powerful men might hide their pasts, but only the truly dangerous ones tried to pretend they never had one. The sealed file was a challenge, and Dr. Vance was not a man who backed down from a challenge. He shifted his search, moving away from the name Volante and focusing instead on the genetic markers. He began searching for any male births registered in the same district and the same year as Leo's deceased brother, looking for any record that contained even partial matches to the unusual haplotype. It was a painstaking, analog process, a search for a ghost in the city's vast, forgotten paper archives. He spent 2 days in the dusty, climate-controlled basement of the Municipal Records Building, a place that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten lives. His fingers, stained with ink and dust, flipped through brittle, yellowed ledgers and microfilm spools. He was surrounded by the quiet, documented history of millions of souls, and he felt a growing certainty that the answer he sought was hidden somewhere in this paper tomb. He was no longer just a doctor. He was an archaeologist, excavating a buried life. The search felt personal now, a crusade for a truth that a powerful man had spent a fortune to bury. He found it on the 3rd day, tucked away in a misfiled box of hospital birth logs from the old St. Jude's Infirmary, a hospital that had been demolished 30 years ago. It was a single, faded sheet of paper, a birth certificate for a boy named Marco Rossi. The parents' names were identical to Leo's. The date of birth matched the age Leo had given for his lost brother. And scribbled in the margins, in the faint, spidery handwriting of a long-dead clerk, was a note referencing a juvenile court case and a subsequent legal name change with a file number attached. The file itself was sealed, but the note was the smoking gun. It was the Rosetta Stone that connected the 2 disparate identities, the bridge between the janitor and the tycoon. Marco Volante had not simply appeared out of thin air. He had been born Marco Rossi, and he had gone to extraordinary lengths to kill that identity, to sever every tie to the family he had left behind. Dr. Vance stood in the silent, dusty archive, the document trembling slightly in his hand, the full, monstrous weight of the discovery settling upon him. This wasn't a medical case anymore. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Dr. Vance did not call Marco's consigliere. He did not file a report through the official channels. He knew that if this information fell into the wrong hands, it would be buried forever, and he along with it. His responsibility was not to the powerful man who paid his consultation fee, but to the truth, and to the unsuspecting man whose life was about to be irrevocably changed. He called Leo and asked him to come to his private office at the hospital, away from the prying eyes and ears of Marco's security detail. The office was a small, quiet space filled with medical textbooks and framed anatomical charts, a stark contrast to the opulence of the sovereign and the grandeur of Abernathy's study. It was a place of facts, of cold, hard biological realities. Leo entered, his heart pounding with a nervous anticipation, unsure of what to expect. He saw the gravity on the old doctor's face and knew this was not a routine meeting. Dr. Vance didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for Leo to sit, and then he laid a single photocopied document on the desk between them. Leo stared at the name, a name he had heard his mother whisper in her sleep 1,000 times, a name that was synonymous with a grief so profound it had broken her. He felt a wave of confusion, unable to understand what this had to do with him, with the donation. Dr. Vance began to speak, his voice calm and measured, laying out the evidence with the precision of a surgeon. He explained the genetic markers, the statistical impossibilities, the sealed files, and the final, irrefutable discovery in the city archives. He connected the dots one by one, drawing a direct, undeniable line between the sick man in the penthouse suite and the grieving family in the rundown apartment building. He spoke of the shared blood, not as a medical curiosity, but as a biological fact of kinship. He let the evidence build, piece by piece, until there was only one possible, monstrous conclusion left. He looked Leo directly in the eye, his own expression a mixture of scientific certainty and deep human compassion. He delivered the final, devastating blow with a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. "Your blood isn't just a match, Leo," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words did not register at first. They were just sounds, syllables hanging in the sterile air of the office, devoid of meaning.
Leo's mind refused to accept them, to forge the connection between the brother he had mythologized his entire life, the lost, gentle boy from his mother's stories, and the cold, cruel monster who had humiliated him, threatened him, and was the very source of all his family's pain. It was an impossible paradox, a violation of the fundamental laws of his universe. Then the denial shattered, and the truth crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the muffled sounds of the hospital outside fading into a dull roar in his ears. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold, sickening wave that left him lightheaded and breathless. He saw his mother's face, her eyes clouded with a grief she had carried for 30 years, a grief for the man who was not dead, but had simply chosen to become a monster instead. The full scope of Marco's cruelty was revealed in that moment. He hadn't just abandoned them, he had allowed them to mourn a ghost, a lie, while he built an empire on the foundations of their suffering. A storm of emotions raged within him, grief for the brother he never knew, white-hot fury at the man he had become, and a profound, soul-crushing sorrow for his mother. The years of sacrifice, the abandoned dreams, the daily humiliations, it all recontextualized itself around this one terrible truth. He had been cleaning the floors for the very man who had broken his family. He had been enduring insults from the brother whose memory was a sacred relic in their home. The irony was so bitter, so cosmically cruel, that he felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat, a sound he choked back before it could escape. He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white, anchoring himself against the vertigo that threatened to consume him. Dr. Vance watched him, his expression one of deep concern, but he remained silent, giving Leo the space to process the impossible. He had delivered the truth. Now, the man in front of him had to decide what to do with it. Slowly, agonizingly, the storm inside Leo began to subside. The chaotic swirl of shock and rage began to cool, to crystallize into something new. It was a clarity so sharp and cold it felt like a shard of ice in his chest. The board was no longer just about survival or leverage. The game had changed. This was not about negotiating a price for his blood. This was about a reckoning. He now held a truth more powerful than all of Marco's money, more potent than any of his threats. It was a truth that could not only destroy Marco's empire, but could also shatter the very foundation of the identity he had so carefully constructed. Leo looked up at Dr. Vance, and the doctor saw the change in his eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a resolve that was as hard and unyielding as granite. He finally understood the true purpose of his journey. He was not just a donor, he was a judge, and a sentence was long overdue. He had the irrefutable proof, and his plan, once a vague strategy for survival, now had a single, clear objective. He would not just save a life or expose a lie. He would force a monster to look at his own reflection and confront the ghosts he had created. The final confrontation was no longer a negotiation, it was a trial, and he would be the one delivering the verdict. The pre-operative suite was a world bleached of all color and warmth, a sterile antechamber between life and the potential for death. The air itself felt thin, scrubbed clean of any scent except the sharp, clinical tang of antiseptic and the faint, metallic odor of sterilized steel. It was a place of absolute neutrality, where power and wealth were rendered meaningless by the great equalizer of human frailty. Marco Volante, the man who commanded empires from rooms of dark wood and rich leather, was now just a patient, a collection of vital signs displayed in cold, green numbers on a humming monitor. He lay beneath a thin, starchy white sheet, the bespoke silk suits replaced by a humiliatingly simple hospital gown that did nothing to hide the new, sharp angles of his body or the sallow, grayish pallor of his skin. Intravenous lines snaked from his arm, tethering him to a chrome stand like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Each rhythmic drip from the bags above, a quiet, merciless tick of the clock. He was a king stripped of his crown and his kingdom, reduced to a fragile vessel of failing biology. Into this silent, sterile theater walked Leo Rossi. The soft, worn rubber of his simple shoes made almost no sound on the polished linoleum floor, a ghost returning to the world he had once been invisible in. But he was not the same man. The stoop of the janitor was gone, replaced by a straight, unyielding posture. His gaze, once perpetually lowered in a gesture of deference, was now level and direct, his eyes holding a cold, clear fire that the sterile room could not extinguish. He carried no weapon, but his very presence was an indictment, a physical manifestation of a history Marco had spent a lifetime trying to bury. In his hand, he clutched a single small object, its worn edges a familiar comfort against his palm. He was not here to negotiate or to threaten. He was here to preside over a final, long overdue accounting. The air grew thick with unspoken history, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sound in a silence that stretched back 30 decades. Leo did not speak immediately.
He walked to the side of the bed, his movements deliberate and unhurried, the calm center of a storm that had been brewing for a generation. He stood over the diminished figure in the bed, looking down at the face of the man who was both his tormentor and his kin. He saw the flicker of annoyance in Marco's eyes, the last vestiges of the tyrant's pride warring with the palpable fear of the dying man. The vulture was cornered, stripped of his talons and his entourage, and he despised the vulnerability, despised the man who was a living mirror of it. Leo slowly raised his hand, uncurling his fingers to reveal the object he held. It was not a legal document or a weapon. It was a photograph, its colors faded to muted sepia tones by the relentless passage of time, its corners soft and creased from years of being held by his mother's grieving hands. It depicted two young boys on a sun-drenched summer afternoon, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, their faces split by identical, gap-toothed grins of pure, uncomplicated joy. The older boy, his hair a wild, dark mop, held a protective, proprietary arm around his smaller, younger brother. They were Marco and Leo Rossi, frozen in a moment of innocence before ambition had curdled into poison, before one brother had chosen to become a ghost and the other a prisoner of that ghost's memory. Leo held the photograph steady, positioning it directly in Marco's line of sight, forcing him to look, to see the boy he had murdered to become the man he was. The beeping of the heart monitor beside the bed began to quicken, a frantic electronic testament to a past that was refusing to remain buried, its sudden, erratic rhythm betraying the lie of the calm, arrogant facade Marco desperately tried to maintain. A muscle twitched in Marco's jaw. His eyes, clouded with sickness and a dawning, horrified recognition, darted from the photograph to Leo's face and back again. He saw the resemblance now, the shared line of a brow, the shape of the eyes, features he had never bothered to notice on the face of the man who cleaned his floors. The janitor was not just an anonymous member of the underclass. He was a relic, an artifact from a life Marco had meticulously and brutally expunged from the record. The carefully constructed walls of his new identity, built over 30 years, with a mortar of lies and ruthlessness, began to crumble. A tremor ran through his hand, the same one he usually masked with displays of power, but now it was violent, uncontrollable. The boy in the photograph was a ghost he had buried under a mountain of money and a new name, a ghost he never thought he would have to face again. He tried to speak, to summon the old familiar voice of command, to dismiss this absurdity, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by a history he could no longer deny. It was then that Leo spoke, his voice not loud, but it cut through the sterile silence of the room with the precision of a scalpel. It was quiet, calm, and utterly devoid of the fear Marco had always commanded. He was not asking a question, he was issuing a final, unbreakable decree. He pointed a single, steady finger at the image of the older boy, the smiling, carefree child who had not yet learned to hate his own name. "I don't need your money," Leo said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of Marco's collapsing world. The demand hung in the air, a simple string of words that held the weight of a lifetime of betrayal. It was an impossible request, for to say that name, Marco Rossi, would be to unravel the entire tapestry of his existence, to admit that the titan Marco Volante was a fiction, a character built on the ashes of a boy who ran away from poverty and familial love. The heart monitor's beeping became a frantic, high-pitched alarm, a siren wailing against the catastrophic failure of his defenses. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. His entire being was locked in a war with itself. The vulture, the predator who had clawed his way to the top of the food chain, screamed at him to destroy this man, to use his last ounce of strength to crush this ghost from the past. But the little boy in the photograph, the forgotten child named Marco Rossi, was crying out from a shallow grave deep within his soul. He looked at Leo's eyes, and for the first time, he saw not a subordinate, but a brother. And in that recognition, the dam of his denial finally broke. A terrible, guttural sob ripped through him, a sound of pure, undiluted agony that was ugly and raw and utterly human. It was the sound of a soul shattering. Tears, hot and shameful, streamed down his sallow cheeks, mixing with the cold sweat of his illness. The confession, when it came, was not a single sentence, but a torrent, a broken, fragmented litany of a life built on shame and flight. He confessed it all, the teenage arrogance, the burning shame of their poverty, the decision to fake his own death to be reborn as someone powerful, someone who could never be hurt or looked down upon again. He confessed to knowing about their mother's pain, to following her decline from a distance, his guilt a secret cancer that gnawed at him even as his physical one did. He finally looked at Leo, his gaze stripped of all artifact, and whispered the name, not as a word, but as a surrender. Marco.
My name was Marco Rossi. Justice in the comments if you got chills when Leo finally forced the truth out of the brother who had abandoned him. How did that final confrontation make you feel? Share your reaction with us below while we witness the aftermath of this life-altering confession. The blood transfusion was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. It was a simple, biological transaction, the physical fulfillment of a contract that had been renegotiated in the currency of truth and pain. As Leo's blood flowed into his brother's veins, it was more than a medical procedure. It was a reclamation, a forced reunion of a bloodline that had been violently severed. Marco survived. The operation was a success, but the man who recovered was not the same one who had gone under the knife. The illness had been purged from his body, but the poison of his past had been drawn to the surface, and it had changed him irrevocably. He was haunted now, not by the fear of death, but by the memory of the life he had destroyed. A few weeks later, in a sterile conference room with a view of the city he no longer felt he owned, he met with a team of his lawyers. He was gaunt and pale, but his voice held a new, somber authority. He gave them a series of cold, precise instructions. A blind trust was to be established, funded with 9 figures from his personal accounts, with a single anonymous beneficiary, his mother. It would provide for her every need, for the best care in the world for the rest of her days. Furthermore, he dictated the charter for a new organization, the Rossi Foundation, endowed with 1/4 of Volante Capital's legitimate assets. Its mission was simple and brutally ironic: to provide aid and legal support to families who had been destroyed by the very organized crime that had made him a king. It was not an act of charity. It was an act of penance, a desperate, inadequate attempt to balance the scales of a life lived so profoundly out of balance. He was not seeking redemption, for he knew that was impossible. He was simply paying a debt, the first honest transaction of his entire adult life. Leo Rossi wanted no part of that world. He refused any position in Marco's empire, rejected any further contact beyond the legal necessities. His victory was not measured in stock options or board seats. It was measured in peace. His ascension was not to a penthouse, but to a small, sunlit house on a quiet, tree-lined street, far from the cold shadows of the city's skyscrapers. The sovereign, with its sense of old money and quiet cruelty, became a distant, fading nightmare. His new life smelled of freshly cut grass, baking bread, and the lavender soap his mother loved. He spent his days with her, not as a desperate caregiver burdened by financial strain, but as a son. He saw the fog of 30 years of unresolved grief finally begin to lift from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, contented light. He would read to her in the afternoons, not the dense historical tomes he once loved, but simple stories with happy endings. He had fulfilled his life's singular motivation. He had given his mother the peace she had been denied for so long. The money from the trust was simply a tool, the means to an end that had always been about dignity, not wealth. He had faced the monster who had broken his family, and without throwing a single punch, had brought him to his knees with the simple, undeniable power of the truth. He had proven that his blood, the blood Marco had derided as thin and worthless, was valuable not for its rarity, but for the humanity, the sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of family it represented. Leo's incredible journey from an invisible janitor to the quiet arbiter of justice is a powerful reminder that true strength is not found in a bank account or a title, but in the courage to stand for what is right. It teaches us that the past, no matter how deeply we bury it, has a way of returning, and that the most profound victories are those won not for power, but for peace and for honor. His story shows that even in the face of overwhelming arrogance and cruelty, the simple, immutable truths of family and identity can become the most powerful weapons of all, capable of toppling empires and forcing even the most hardened souls to confront the ghosts they have created. The ultimate justice was not in his punishment, but in his family's healing, a testament to the idea that the greatest revenge is not destruction, but the quiet, dignified act of rebuilding what was broken. If Leo Rossi's incredible journey from an overlooked underdog to a powerhouse of moral strength inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see proof that character will always triumph over cruelty. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, where the forgotten find their voice and the arrogant are brought to account, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next time we prove that the most powerful force in the universe isn't money, but the unbreakable spirit of a good person who has been pushed too far.